The move the pawn to c4 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to e4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to c5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to f3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to e6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to d4 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the c-file takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Black responds symmetrically, maintaining the dynamic balance. A solid, accurate move that keeps the position equal. White continues development with a flexible move, solidifying their structure. The position remains dynamically balanced. The move the pawn to d5 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to e5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to g3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to b4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to g2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking short castles with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to e4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures the pawn, opening the central file, a solid continuation that maintains the slight advantage. Black recaptures with the knight, developing. This solid move keeps the game in a balanced state. White fianchettos the bishop, preparing kingside castling and hypermodern central control. A solid positional choice. The move the pawn to g6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to e5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the bishop to g2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to b6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to f3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to c6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to d3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White develops the bishop to the long diagonal, utilizing the fianchetto setup effectively, maintains the slight edge. Black exchanges knights, simplifying slightly. This move solidifies black's central pawn structure. White recaptures with the pawn, creating doubled pawns. Solid play, keeping the positional advantage. Black develops the bishop to a strong diagonal, activating the piece. A solid move maintaining pressure. White develops the knight, preparing for castling and central action. Solid play, maintaining the advantage. Black castles, securing the king. A solid move that brings the king to safety and maintains equality. The move the bishop to a3 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to h4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to e5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables short castles to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to e8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to d4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to c6, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the knight to d7 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to a6, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the pawn to d4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to c5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby short castles secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the queen to a5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to c1, guaranteeing long-term space control. White castles, connecting the rooks. A solid move that secures the king and prepares for the middle game. The move the pawn to c5 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to e8, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the pawn to h4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to e5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to g5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to f6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to b3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White pushes a central pawn, seizing space. A solid move that strengthens white's central presence. Black centralizes the queen, adding support to the pawn advance. A solid developing move. White pushes the king's pawn, opening lines for development. Solid play that maintains the balance. Black places the rook on an open file, increasing activity. A solid move that prepares for central tension. White repositions the queen, coordinating with other pieces. A solid move, maintaining the slight advantage. Black advances the king's pawn, challenging white's center. A solid move that increases the game's dynamism. The move the rook on the f-file to d1 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook on the a-file to d1, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the pawn to c4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to b4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the e-file takes on d4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the c-file takes on d4, executes a favorable trade. This allows the pawn to a5, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black captures the central pawn, opening the structure. A solid exchange in the center. White recaptures, maintaining pawn presence in the center. A solid move that keeps equality. Black exchanges pawns, simplifying the central tension. A solid move that maintains the balance. The move the knight takes on d4 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook on the a-file to c1, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the queen to b6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to a4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to e5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the knight takes on e5, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the bishop takes on e5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the queen to b6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to c5, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the queen to c3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to g4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the queen takes on c5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the queen takes on c5, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the bishop takes on c5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the queen to c3 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the queen to e3, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates, paving the way for the knight to e5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to f5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the bishop takes on f5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the e-file takes on f5, executes a favorable trade. This allows the knight to g4, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black repositions the knight, centralizing it effectively. A solid move that capitalizes on white's mistake. White develops the bishop to an active diagonal. Solid play. But the position remains disadvantageous. The move the queen to c7 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to a6, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Paving the way for the pawn to e5, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the bishop takes on e5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Whereby the queen to b4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the pawn to h5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to f1, guaranteeing long-term space control. White activates the knight, targeting pawn weaknesses. Solid play, though black retains a significant edge. The move the bishop takes on c3 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the queen to c6, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Paving the way for the knight to d4, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the queen to e8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the pawn to e5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the queen takes on e5 executes a favorable trade. This allows the queen to a3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures the knight, winning material. Solid play that equalizes the position. Black develops the bishop, creating counterplay. A solid move that keeps the game active. White exchanges rooks, simplifying the position. A solid move that maintains equality. Black recaptures the rook, maintaining the material balance. A solid move in an equal position. White places the rook on the open file. A solid move that prepares for further action. Black repositions the bishop to a more active square. A solid move that improves piece activity. White moves the rook to the second rank. Solid positional play that supports the pawn structure. Black centralizes the knight, aiming for a stronger outpost, a solid maneuver to improve piece placement. White exchanges knights, simplifying the pawn structure. Solid play that maintains the equal status. Black recaptures with the bishop, maintaining piece activity. A solid move that keeps the balance. White captures a pawn on the flank. Solid tactical play that aims to create a weakness. Black recaptures the pawn, maintaining material equality. A solid response to White's capture. White captures the pawn, activating the rook. Solid play that seeks to exploit the pawn structure. Black delivers a check with the rook, forcing king movement. A solid move that disrupts White's plans. White moves the bishop back, defending. Solid defensive play to maintain the pawn structure. Black repositions the bishop to a central square. Solid tactical thinking to improve piece activity. White captures a pawn with the rook, gaining material. Solid positional advantage gained. Black recaptures the rook, simplifying into an endgame. Solid simplification maintaining the balance. White delivers a check with the rook. Solid tactical play to force the king into a less secure position. Black moves the king to safety. Solid defensive maneuver to protect the king. White pushes a pawn, preparing for king safety. Solid strategy to reinforce the king's position. Black delivers a check with the bishop. Solid tactical move to disrupt White's king safety. White moves the king, dodging the check. Solid defensive reaction to maintain king safety. Black delivers another check with the rook. Solid tactical pressure on the White king. White moves the king again, seeking safety. Solid king maneuver in a tense position. Black delivers a check with the rook. Solid continuation of tactical pressure. White moves the king, navigating the checks. Solid king movement to avoid immediate threats. Black advances a pawn, creating space. Solid pawn push for positional improvement. White advances a pawn, opening lines for the king. Solid strategy to activate the king. Black checks the king with a pawn. Solid tactical move to gain tempo. White moves the king, escaping the check. Solid king repositioning to maintain safety. Black repositions the bishop to a strong outpost. Solid piece improvement to control key squares. White moves the bishop, creating a blockade. Solid defensive move to restrict black's activity. Black advances a pawn, opening a file for the rook. Solid pawn play for initiative. White captures the pawn, opening the position. Solid exchange that creates dynamic chances. Black advances the pawn again, creating a passed pawn threat. Solid push that aims for long-term advantage. White repositions the king towards the center. Solid strategy to activate the king in the endgame. Black captures the pawn with the rook, creating a check. Solid tactical sequence to gain material. White moves the king, escaping the check. Solid king maneuver in a complex endgame. Black moves the rook to an active file. Solid rook play aiming for decisive activity. White delivers a check with the bishop. Solid tactical move to disrupt black's king. Black moves the king to safety. Solid king retreat to avoid further threats. White moves the king, seeking central control. Solid endgame strategy to centralize the king. The move the pawn to g3 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the rook to f3 with check, delivering a check that forces defensive coordination, paving the way for the king to e5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to h3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the king to f6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. White develops the bishop to a strong outpost, capitalizing on the blunder. Overwhelming winning advantage.